Today we'll be unboxing an iPad Air that I got open box, and supposedly this is still running iOS 7. Now I got this from my buddy Mac Throwback, so shouts out to him. He also chucked in a smart cover, which is good because I have a feeling this is going to be super mint. Okay, alright, now let's get this thing out of its wrapping. Okay, and wow, this thing is super mint. And the nice thing about this is that it's in the white and silver color. Now, I've been wanting one of these in white and silver for a bit now. I only have one in space gray. As this powers on, let's take a look at some of the stuff that we get with this. Of course, we get the charging brick and everything. We get our charger, of course. I mean, Apple would never give this to you today. You'd only get this. Let's take a look at what we got in this pamphlet right here. And looks like we just get a little bit of paperwork here and our Apple stickers. Now, let's take a look at this iPad Air, and I do have slide to unlock, and the font does look Helvetica New, and I do think this is iOS 7. And looks like we have a 32 gig model on 7.1.1. Now let's talk a bit about the specs and history of the iPad Air first generation. The iPad Air 1 was first announced on October the 22nd of 2013 and was officially released on the 1st of November that year. The version of iOS 7 this iPad released with was 7.0.3, meaning we have the second latest and one of the most stable versions of iOS 7 for this device, aka 7.1.1. The iPad Air 1 was completely different in terms of design and internals to its predecessor, the iPad 4th generation. Although I have a case on it, you can kind of tell it featured a much more thinner and lighter design compared to its predecessor, the iPad 4th generation. And this design is closer to that iPad mini 1 that released a year before this one. And it's basically a blown up version of the design that you saw on the iPad mini 1, as you very much can see. It has a much more boxy look. It is very thin and light. And if we look at the iPad Air, you can also see it pretty much has that same exact design. So here's another iPad Air 1. And for example, on the iPad Air 1, the color is not only on the bezels like you would see on a previous iPad, it is also on the back part of the housing, just like that iPad mini 1. As if we look at its predecessor, the iPad 4th gen, you can see that the back is silver and the color would only be on the bezels. And although this is a black one, if you got this in the white color, things like the volume buttons and the back like antenna cover would also be in black, no matter if the bezels on the front were white. This also is a good time to go over the two color options this thing had. It had a silver and white option and a space gray option, which was new for the time. As on previous iPads like the iPad mini 1, the only like blackish color that you could get was slate, and this was replaced with space gray due to like durability issues that the slate color had, especially with like the paint chipping, as if you like dropped it or something very slightly, it would chip super easily. And what you got is basically a lighter version of slate, and that would be space gray. So for example, this is a slate iPhone 5 and this is a space gray iPad Air 1, and you kind of can see the difference here. Slate has a much darker look. This design update was very much needed in my opinion, as the iPad 4 pretty much still had that same exact design that you saw on the 2011 iPad 2, and they went through 3 iPads with this same like heavy design, so it was very much needed. Although on the iPad 3 it was slightly different and it got updated for the Retina display, and the iPad 4 pretty much has the same design as the iPad 3 in terms of thickness. That just makes these a bit more heavier compared to something like the iPad 2. And overall, iPads of the time were just continuing to get heavier and heavier. So it's crazy that the iPad Air 1 would decrease the overall grams of the iPad by 183. It is noticeably slimmer and lighter at the cost of having a slightly worse battery, but it is significantly faster, and it is also much more boxy and has way smaller and better looking bezels. So if we go look at the iPad 4th gen, you will see what I mean. The bezels on this thing are absolutely massive. And the iPad Air 1 also had the diamond chamfered edge, which was on the iPad mini 1. And this was brand new for the iPad lineup pretty much, as I mean, the iPad mini 1 got the first generation of that. And this is pretty much just following the design of the iPhone 5 and 5S. And you can kind of see it is kind of reflective on the corners of this iPad. And of course, the older design did not have that. And also, since it had the same design as the iPad mini 1, that also meant it finally got stereo speakers. So you can see those 2 speakers on the bottom of this thing. On the previous iPad, you would get 1 speaker towards the bottom, and it kind of sucks, while these were much better. The design of the iPad Air 1 would pretty much be kept for years and would only have tiny modifications in the future on this design, specifically with things like the removal of the mute or rotation lock switch on the side, as that would just be merged into the control center on something like the iPad Air 2. The only other thing that would happen and would be changed to this design also is they would get more iPad Air 2 like speakers, and that's about it. So for example, this is an iPad Air 2 with its speakers, and you can see it lacks that mute or rotations lock switch, whatever you want to call it. But this design would be kept for years and appear on things like the 2017 iPad 5th gen or the 2018 iPad 6th gen, because they pretty much have the same exact design with minimal color changes. Mainly the reason this design was used into the future over something like the iPad Air 2's design is because overall it was much more durable due to it being thicker. The iPad Air 2's design overall was way too thin, and I could like bend one of those in half because of how thin they were. But that's not saying the iPad Air 1 was completely destructible either, because you could definitely bend one of these. It's just a bit harder due to its thicker dimensions. Now back to the screen itself. The actual bezels around the screen are much thinner, as we talked about earlier, and it just shrunk down the size of the device quite a bit while still having the screen itself being the same 9.7 inches, and it's just a lot better in my opinion. The screen is also the same resolution as the iPad 4 and iPad 3. Now onto the actual internals of this thing. It now featured the 64-bit A7 chip first seen in the iPhone 5S over there. It is significantly faster in demanding tasks like gaming with this 64-bit chip. This of course allowed it to be supported all the way up until iOS 12, and recently it actually got a security update for iOS 12.5.8, which is kind of crazy, but of course it really does not run great on iOS 12. And overall the performance jump on this thing was like 2x versus something like the iPad 4th gen, which is absolutely insane. Although the RAM on these were kind of lacking with only 1 gig, which for 2013 was kind of low if I'm being completely honest. Some Android competitors definitely had the jump on that front, but the A7 processor and Apple's overall software kind of made up for that. If this ran Android, for example, it would be a lot slower due to it having a way less optimized operating system. But that's not saying the 1 gig of RAM stuck on these iPads much longer, because the Air 2 released a year later would of course double that RAM, and it is like a night and day difference, especially in tasks that need a lot of RAM. The camera on this device is not really that great either. It only has 5 megapixels, and they are pretty much the exact same on the iPad 4 also, so there's not really much difference, other than that this thing now features HDR. As you can see up here, you can switch that on and off. And the storage sizes you could get on this thing were ranging from 16 to 128 and pretty much anything in between, so 16, 32, 64, 128. And now let's talk about the one thing that really bothers me about this iPad. It lacks Touch ID. It launched with the 5S the same year, and the Air 1 was also the top of the line iPad at the time, yet it lacks it completely. I don't know why they waited till the Air 2 on this thing. They could have easily implemented that. And there's nothing else really noteworthy on this thing in terms of hardware, so let's get into the software of iOS 7. iOS 7 was the first time Apple had done a major redesign. The only redesign they have done in the past was like redesign the dock. I'll throw up some images of this, as like on iPhone OS 3 it had a mesh looking dock, and on iPhone OS 4 you got the much more macOS style dock, and also in iOS 4 you got wallpapers on the home screen. And the only other thing they did was they slightly changed the color palette in iOS 6 to make it a little bit more blue looking. But iOS 7 was a complete game changer in that regard, as they completely redesigned everything to be more flat and modern. This can be seen across the whole entire software, from the lock screen of course lacking any skeuomorphic elements, and the cool sound it makes when you open it is just completely gone. See, now here is iOS 6. It's just gone on iOS 7. And before we continue, if you do not know what skeuomorphism is, it's basically a UI design that mimics real-life objects. This can be seen from things like the Notes app, which mimics a real notepad, the Clock app, which looks like a real clock, and the icon on the photo booth, which looks like a real photo booth. So if we look at all things I just mentioned on iOS 7, you can very much see that they are absent. Starting off with the Notes app, it looks a ton bit flatter. Of course, there still is a tiny bit of texture right there, because I mean, it's early flat design. That's just kind of how it is, where it's not completely flat if we're going to be completely real, but it's still definitely flat design. And let's also go look at that Clock app. Yeah, it's not skeuomorphic. Let's also go look at that Photo Booth app, and it's a lot less skeuomorphic. iOS 7 also featured these cool Gaussian blur effects, like especially on that dock, instead of like a actual physical dock. It also had this parallax effect, which may be hard to see, but you can see the apps are floating over the wallpaper pretty much with this illusion that is the parallax effect. And this was not on previous iOS versions. And it kind of just gives iOS a much more three-dimensional look. And this is still present on things like iOS 26 or iOS 27. It's just not nearly as strong as something like iOS 7, as you can see. And when this launched, people complained this gave them motion sickness. So what Apple ended up doing was adding a reduced motion feature in iOS 7.1, kind of late into the life cycle. So overall, iOS 7 now featured a much more flatter and translucent looking design. But you may ask, what is their reason for doing this? Well, with the launch of Apple Maps on iOS 6, which by the way, that is where it launched, on prior iOS versions, of course, Apple just used the generic Google Maps app. But on 6, they released Apple Maps, which was in their in-house version of Maps. So let me go show you that right now. And yeah, you can see it. And on launch, it was severely buggy. This can just kind of be seen by the many pictures I could probably show you of how it looked, or from looking at the icon, as it kind of shows somebody driving off an overpass. The lead dev of Apple Maps in 2012 was a guy named Scott Forstall, and he was not your ordinary guy that made the Maps app. No, he was the lead designer of majority of Apple's skeuomorphic era, and he pretty much designed every iOS version from iOS 1 all the way up until iOS 6, of course. But with the massive controversy that came with the absolute horrid state of Apple Maps, Apple wanted to apologize to see if they could minimize some of that outrage. So Tim Cook wrote an apology letter and wanted Scott Forstall to sign that, of course, which he refused. And the result was kind of a culmination of past things that had happened internally. Ever since the death of Steve Jobs, Scott really did not have anyone to advocate for his skeuomorphic designs. Steve was a massive advocate for those designs, of course, and Tim Cook was not really as pro-skeuomorphic as him. And Forstall also frequently clashed with the hardware designer at the time, Jony Ive, which he will come into picture in a second, and the other top executives at Apple. And this was kind of a final straw between Timothy and Scott, which they would fire and replace with Jony Ive. Now, Jony was the biggest advocate for flat and minimalist designs, so with the following year came the biggest visual redesign Apple has ever done, bigger than something like liquid glass and bigger than iOS 11. iOS 7. Everything was now flat, from the same things we talked about earlier, like the notepad, camera icon, and the removal of like linen and grain felt in the game center, which I didn't mention earlier, and iOS 7 pretty much became the most controversial update ever, as it pushed everyone towards the flat era, and not just Apple, as they kind of influenced everyone else in the tech space to kind of do the same thing. It was released to mixed reception, with some really liking that new design and others kind of hating it and preferring the older design. But overall, people eventually kind of warmed up to this new look and started to prefer it. Overall, I still kind of prefer the older design that you would see on something like iOS 6, but I still don't think iOS 7's design looks horrible. I actually kind of like it, and I've kind of liked it more and more over time. Now onto the features. iOS 7 added the control center, which I don't know where we would be without this, which took all of the settings that you could change on the daily and like settings and just put it all into this one little panel that all you gotta do to access is swipe up, and it is so much easier. Like, you can change your Wi-Fi, airplane mode, Bluetooth, do not disturb, rotation lock, all from here. So it is much better than having to like go and open up multiple apps to go mess around with controls. On iOS 6, for example, you would get basic multitasking, where you could of course go in and out of apps and change a couple settings, and it's not as nearly as many as something like the control center. They also separated the actual multitasking part from the control center, so to go in and out of an app, all you have to do is press the home button twice, of course, and you can go in and out of any other app here, and you can actually see what the inside of the app looks like. And to close out of it, all you have to do is swipe up. Now, on previous iOS versions, it was not that convenient. On iOS 6, for example, if you wanted to go in and out of an app, you of course could do that very easily. But to close out of an app, it was quite annoying. You would have to press down on one of these app icons and press this little tiny red icon towards the corner of each app icon. So it's not quite as convenient. The notification center also has like a new Today tab with a bunch of stuff in there. And the camera app also got a bigger redesign, where you could just go through all of your options at once super easily. As on iOS 6, you would have to like go through hoops to like, for example, turn on panoramic mode. And photos were now organized by time and location into moments in your Photos app. And that is pretty much everything new with iOS 7. And now let's just explore the device a little bit. Let's start off with the wallpaper selection on iOS 7. It has some of the best wallpapers, in my opinion, in any iOS version by far. Like the default blue nebula wallpaper, banger. This Earth one, absolute banger. This other galaxy option, banger. This mountain, banger. This like painting, I don't even know what you would call this. It kind of looks like a painting. Wallpaper, banger. This is one of my favorite ones of all time. It's of some like water. This one of some like pastures or like meadows, I don't know what you would call that. This one's like a black and white version of like a nature scene. I don't know what you'd call this, like a lake maybe. This one's of some green pastures. This one is carried over from previous iOS versions. It's of like the ocean. This one's carried over from previous iOS versions as also of the ocean. This one is of some like waves crashing. This one's carried over from previous iOS versions. This one is new, and I do really like this one. This one's also new, I think. This one's carried over from a previous iOS version. This one is new, and pretty much everything below here are some abstract options that are also new, and none of them here are bad, unlike some iOS versions. iOS 7 also introduced a bunch of new sounds, so let's go through those right now, starting off with the ringtones. And then down here you get your classic options. Now let's go through the alert tones. I would go through other stuff, but it wouldn't be really interesting. So that is a look at this open box iOS 7 iPad Air. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing with notifications on, sharing the video, and hyping the video. Also consider checking out my social media accounts, which I'll have in the description and in the end card. I have a TikTok, a Twitter, a second YouTube channel where I now post my short form content, and I also have a Reddit account. But yeah, this has been Derek from CertifiedLegacy, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.
What we do here is go back.